The third UK Communities Conference took place again at Braziers Park in Oxfordshire during July 2024. It was a well-attended in-person event that was enjoyed by many. The Intentional Communities Research Group has been running symposia since 2014. Their 2024 symposium became a part of the UK Communities Conference, with live sessions every evening that were also streamed online to participants around the world. On Thursday, July the 18th, the symposium focused on the presentation of academic research, with contributions from Rhiannon Firth of University College London, Kirsten Stevens-Wood of Cardiff Metropolitan University, and Bruno Friedel of Oxford University. The session was chaired by Jenny Peckerell, who is a professor in environmental geography at the University of Sheffield.
Welcome, everyone. I'm going to get us started. We are expecting other people to come in to the room here at Braziers Park, and also other people might well join us online. My name is Jenny Pickerell. I am been writing about eco-communities for a long time now, so I'm quite excited to also get to be at Braziers Park and be part of the Intentional Communities Conference this weekend. But this is the Intentional Communities Symposium, organised by Kirsten, who we also have talking today, and I will be chairing. We are going to have 3 different talks, which I will introduce in a minute. And after each one, there'll be a chance for questions and answer session of about 10 minutes each. And you can ask either way, either in the room by putting up your hand, and hopefully someone there will let us know online what that question is. And we can put it in the chat, or you can put your hand up. So I'll let you know when we're ready, just to let you know that we are recording this so that other people can watch it at a later date. So I would like to start off. I'm very excited to welcome Rhiannon Firth to talk to us. She comes from UCL in London and is very prolific in terms of writing around a variety of intentional communities and different questions around them. And today I understand, Rhiannon, that you're going to talk about food security. So I'm going to pass over to you. You have about 40 minutes, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. And if you've just joined us, just to remind you to mute while we listen to Rhiannon. Rhiannon, sorry, it's been a long day. And you can just put on speaker view if you'd like to while we listen to her. So over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. I'm just going to share my screen because I've got a PowerPoint to show you. Okay, so is that working?
Yes, that looks perfect.
Okay, so I'm in my talk today. I'm going to be asking the question: do intentional communities have a role to play in wider food justice and resilience? So a summary of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about a research project I did recently. And as I'll explain, the research project itself didn't centre on intentional communities, although there were some members of intentional communities who were interviewed and were very involved in the movement that I studied. And I'm going to try and talk about that research project a little bit, but then refocus it by thinking about broadening the questions to kind of centre on intentional communities and what role do intentional communities, or could intentional communities play, especially because this is a project I'd like to work on in the future. So I'd be interested also to discuss with the audience any input they might have in sort of directions for future research or ways that I might develop that. I'm going to start with a critique of mainstream food discourse. I'm going to do a bit of background about social movements and food. I'm going to think about intentional communities and food. And I'm going to end by asking the questions: what do intentional communities prefigure? And how can they contribute to wider social change within the food system? And then hopefully I'll have some time for questions and discussion. Although I can't remember, are we doing the presentations all at once and then questions, or are we doing questions for each?
No, we'll do questions at the end so that people can come and go. So there'll be 10 minutes straight after your talk.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I did this research project about a year ago now, and I got 10 grand from UCL to do this project. The call was about food security, which is a horrible language that I don't like very much. I'll go into that a bit more later. And I did the project with Emma O'Dwyer, who's at Greenwich University, and James Fox, who's at the University of Exeter. We're currently working together to publish from this research. And it involved 20 interviews with people involved in social movements, cooperatives, mutual aid networks, and an intentional community. We also produced a documentary film with 3 of the groups, and I'm going to provide a link to that at the end, so you can watch that in your own time. I was hoping to show 10 minutes or so of it, but I realised that it'd just be a squash, and it's a half-hour documentary. So if anyone's really interested, there's a link to watch it in your own time. This talk also draws on my own previous research on intentional communities. So I've done a lot of research on intentional communities, including my PhD, and published that, but I haven't specifically focused it on food. So I'm bringing together these sort of 2 different research interests of mine, which do have a bit of overlap, to try and sort of think through some future directions. So I'm seeking to explore the roles and potential of intentional communities working alongside other grassroots and communities in reimagining food systems and fighting against food insecurity. So as I've said, it's an exploratory talk. I haven't done empirical research focusing on this area yet, or at least not focusing exclusively on intentional communities, though, as I said, there were members of intentional communities involved in this research project. Okay, so contemporary discourse around food problems and solutions. These are a sort of mixture of academic and popular mainstream discourse. So there's a discourse, and this is all become increasingly important, especially after COVID. During COVID, there was a sort of crisis of food security, insofar as many people struggled to access food. And it led to this huge sort of surge in social movement activity around trying to get food to people, often done in terms of mutual aid and things. But since then, there's been a cost of living crisis, and just the neoliberal austerity that's been going on for, well over a decade, has intensified quite severely, and food insecurity is a real issue in the United Kingdom. So there's this the discourse around food security is a discourse that is very heavily about securitizing food, which I don't like. I don't like any discourse about securitizing things, because it's like, who are you securitizing against? It's very much a discourse about bordering and sort of keeping some things safe at the expense of keeping other things out. Another discourse is an argument around the right to food. So people should have a right to food, sort of a human right to food, or a right that comes with British citizenship, perhaps. But the problem with discourse around rights is that rights are sort of assumed to be given by a government, which means they can also be taken away by whoever's bestowing them. It kind of gives power away from communities in a way. There's another discourse around food poverty. So whether people are in this category of poverty or not, in the sense of whether they have enough to eat. But the problem with this discourse is it tends to sort of individualize differences. It does try to look at structural issues, but there's a sort of issue around how individuals and communities should it's something that is a status rather than something that people can work together as communities towards overcoming. There's another discourse around food injustice and justice, and this is actually the discourse that most of my participants in my research project used. And it tends to try and look at structural factors beyond just access to food, so things like cultural affirmation, whether people's cultural backgrounds are accounted for in whatever solutions or mitigations to help people get access to food are given. There's a discourse around food sovereignty, and some people think that this word sovereignty is quite a sort of tricky term because it's often associated with nation states, but this is also quite a radical discourse around food that comes from the the Global South sort of land workers movement. And it centres food producers and consumers and ecologies over markets. There's also a whole movement and discourse around ethical consumerism and market-based solutions, so the ability of individuals to take a bit of power back and change through their own individual consumer choices. I think this is a good strategic solution in some ways, because we do live in a capitalist society and we have to take sort of power back somehow, but obviously it risks putting responsibility on individuals for what's a sort of global structural issue of inequality of access to food. There's discourses around social capital and food capital. So this is very much about the use value of the social and the labour that social movements put in for the state and capital. So I'm very critical of the idea of social capital in some of my other works. So there's a whole sort of food capital discourse that's associated with that I'm also critical of. And then there's an emerging academic discourse around alternative food networks alternative food networks and autonomous food spaces, and that links to anarchism. So I think it might be a good model for understanding some of the practices that go on in intentional communities, although that's quite an emerging discourse and I'm quite interested to see where that goes. Okay, so looking at the food system, what is a food system? In the mainstream literature on food, it divides the cycle with varying degrees of complexity into around 4 to 7 stages. So there's a picture here that sort of just simplifies it into 4 stages: production, processing, consumption, and distribution. A more complex model might look at growing and producing, processing, transport, retailing, distributing, preparing, eating, and waste management. So this is how academic literatures on food divide up what happens from getting food from wherever it's grown or produced to someone's plate. And obviously that is, in the era of globalization, a very complex and global process, which is problematic in many ways, obviously for the environment and for the taste of food, for people's access to food. There's all sorts of problems with this kind of alienated capitalist food system. And I won't go into that in a lot of detail now, and I imagine a lot of people watching me at the moment might already have their own critique of the sort of mainstream globalized food system. What are social movements doing about it? How are people resisting this kind of capitalist food system that means that many people in the UK today can't eat properly? So food insecurity is traditionally associated with developing countries, but as I've said, decades of austerity have seen food bank use rise by 81% in the UK. And more of a third of food globally goes to waste every year. Global food production is implicated in climate change, of which food insecurity is also a result. Global supply chains are increasingly prone to disruption due to shocks and disasters. So there's many reasons to promote initiatives to localise food production, distribution, food welfare support, and so on, from building community resilience, reviving local participation, to combating hunger and climate change. So I've left in get example numbers. Okay, so Houston Food Not Bombs is a huge movement. I did actually look it up, and they produce about something like 150,000 meals a year or something ridiculous. They feed a huge number of people. So anarchist mutual aid and other forms of social organising are filling gaps where capital retreats. So this is absolutely huge in the United States, where anarchist movements really are just keeping communities alive. But in the UK, it's also an emerging movement, and it's not just anarchists, there's sort of churches, all sorts of local groups and local community groups, and also all sorts of other sort of leftist radical movements and so on are getting involved with food through things like informal food banks, temporary autonomous food distribution, community fridges, and things like that. So one of the concerns that people that are involved in these movements themselves, as well as people who are interested in them, often cite is that these kinds of initiatives are just putting a sticking plaster over the failing welfare state. So they're basically, even though these are radical, often anti-capitalist, anti-statist movements, they're often just keeping the wheels of capitalism running by feeding people who might otherwise be starving and then maybe go out and start a riot or something like that. So even though these movements are trying to do something against and beyond the state, in a way they're sort of helping the state by filling in the gaps where the welfare state fails. And one of my questions is, do intentional communities have a role to play here within this sort of larger movement towards food security? How can we learn from them, and how can we expand their practices? Okay, so this is one of the groups in London that I'm partially involved with, Hackney anarchists who do a breakfast club. I just thought I'd show you this picture of them out on a Sunday morning feeding people outside Dalston Station. So they gave out hundreds of meals that day, which were paid for through a sort of fundraiser that was like a punk gig. So this is just an example of a local sort of urban social movement that's going on at the moment. Okay, so in the research project, we initially wanted to contact informal mutual aid networks and cooperatives. So we wanted to keep our sample to that. But this was difficult in the end because it wasn't always clear from people's websites or the ways we were able to get in touch with people. Some people were in both of these at once. So as I said, I spoke to many people who lived in intentional communities, but they were involved in other organisations. And they wanted to speak about the other organisations that they were working on rather than about their intentional community. But also there were a lot of groups that started out as sort of radical groups, and then they gained charity status or something so they could keep going. So we wanted to try and exclude NGOs and charities, but it ended up being quite difficult because it wasn't always clear. So we ended up speaking to a few charities. So the groups that we spoke to included informal mutual aid groups, an unincorporated association, a community interest company, a cooperative CIC, a worker cooperative, a registered charity. And we did speak to an intentional community, but that was under the cooperative model. What was missing? We didn't speak to any explicitly anarchist or solidarity organisations. We encountered some, but we couldn't negotiate access, although we did speak to some individuals that were inspired by anarchists. And the other thing that's missing is intentional communities. So we actually encountered members of several intentional communities during the research who were involved in other projects, but they wanted to speak about their other projects that were about distributing food to kind of poor people rather than about where they lived and how that was kind of contributing to a wider food movement, even though I did try to encourage people. So only one member of an intentional community agreed to be interviewed as a member of an intentional community. And I think that's a really interesting point that I'd be interested to open up to discussion at the end of that. But I did discuss informally with people, why don't you see your activity and your life within an intentional community as contributing towards this food movement? So I do have some thoughts on that later on. Okay, so there were many groups in our research project, and we found that many of the groups, as well as intentional communities, transgress, combine, or skip the stages of the food cycle that I spoke about earlier. So I spoke about how most mainstream literature divides the food cycle into around 4 to 7 stages of sort of consumption, production, transport, and all that kind of thing. But we found that these separations didn't always make sense in terms of some of the people that we spoke to. So, for example, degrees of self-sufficiency can eliminate the need for some of the steps like transport and retail. And then some of the activities that we encountered with the people we interviewed included growing food, local and organic growing, collecting waste food from supermarkets, distributing food to communities without means testing, subscriptions such as box subscriptions that were done for things like there was a solidarity group network that had a big membership and they did a box scheme for those people. There was also a box scheme that was run out of a housing cooperative. Producing herbal medicine, cooking and sharing meals as communities, or there was a refugee community kitchen, and running a cooperative food shop. So those are some examples of actions that people we spoke to engaged in. So some examples of what they felt to be achievements, what they felt to be successes of the things they were doing were sheer volume of food distributed was a huge claim to fame that people made, feeding people and families in need, providing healthy food to people without means testing, surviving and working together as a group or growing as a group, providing diverse food, education around recipes and food cultures, feeding migrants and people without recourse to public funds, providing people with volunteering and community interaction opportunities, and education, consciousness raising, or being a good example. Some recurring challenges with people we spoke to was having enough volunteers or enough people to sustain commitments made to communities, temporariness, so the fact that a lot of these things arose during COVID when people were on furlough, and then some people had to go back to work and they couldn't continue. And then some of them tried to apply for funding to become formalised as NGOs. And then the problems arose with this funding issue of getting it in the first place, dealing with red tape and bureaucratic procedure. And was it a compromise in values to do this in the first place? A lot of people spoke about how choke points in the UK food system make wider change difficult. So there's like points at which food is kind of amassed and lost and so on, that make it difficult. And then also a lot of people spoke about dealing with difficult people or intra-group dynamics as being one of the reasons that their groups disintegrated in the end. We had a look at some of the values articulated by participants. Many had anti-capitalist values, or they were critical of capitalist food systems. Several cited anarchist or anarchist-ish concepts such as prefiguration, decentralized, non-hierarchical, direct action, and proliferation of small-scale alternatives. Several cited socialist ideals such as the need for a massive redistribution of wealth and land and a universal basic income. Others shared a general leftist discourse of cooperativism, solidarity not charity, food as human right, multiculturalism. And also ecological values such as reducing waste, being kind to the planet, degrowth, addressing climate emergency, and conservationism. So they were very diverse values, but generally to the left of the political spectrum. Some of the motivations people had for joining these groups, a lot of them, as I said, started during COVID. So engaging with other people during lockdown, having a reason to do so, building community, making new friends, addressing a need, addressing systemic problems, enhancing shared values, and also personal desires to eat a certain type of food or the enjoyment of food and growing. So thinking about conditions for thriving, and I think this is one of the places that intentional communities might play a role in a sort of broader food movement, if this is something that we want to seek to further. So the collapse of the welfare system and social care creates a need. This isn't necessarily a good thing, but it is one of the reasons that there is a thriving food justice movement. Lockdown and furlough during COVID-19 meant that volunteers had time. So this was often linked to people saying there's a need for an ongoing universal basic income. And people were saying things like the 5-day working week should be abolished. Policies to address the expense of space and rising rents, especially in London, where I did this research. So some of the spaces that thrived had cheap rents for various reasons, or they were properties that were owned for a long time and were owned by a cooperative. More corporate funding and other resources like corporate volunteering. Somebody mentioned this, saying that corporations ought to pay for their mess and help these food movements. However, other people said this was linked to greenwashing, or it was somehow a compromise. There's a need for policies to address systemic problems like choke points in the food system and supermarket waste. And some respondents were cynical about state or capitalist solutions, saying change needs to come from the grassroots. Okay, so how is all this relevant to intentional communities? So intentional communities are a social movement too, and they connect to many others, especially to the people that I interviewed. As I said, many of the people I spoke to lived in intentional communities. I've researched intentional communities, and my previous research has focused on values and the relationship to social change, but not specifically about food. So as I say, this is something I'd love to do in the future. One of my interviewees in the food project was living in an intentional community, and I spoke to several more, but there was only one who agreed to be interviewed as a member of an intentional community rather than about their other projects. So I'm going to get some quotes. I was going to talk. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So some theoretical concepts. I'm going to skip through these slides a little bit, but these are sort of some of the ways in which, in my previous research, I've perceived intentional communities as contributing to wider social change. And I think these have as much, if not more, relevance for thinking about changing the food system. So one of them is prefigurative politics, which is antagonistic towards vanguard or elite-led revolution or approaches to seizing state power. So it's about building tomorrow today or being the change you want to see in the world. Experimental implementation of desired social relations in the here and now. Attention to informal as well as formal power relations. And it includes mutual aid and direct action, such as we see in urban social movements, but also utopian experiments, such as intentional communities, and radical education practices, such as critical pedagogy and consciousness raising. And I'd recommend this recent book by Paul Rakestad and Sofa Sayegradin as a really good book on prefiguration. Also, I'm really interested in localism and ideas of scale and federation, especially drawing on anarchist literatures. So the idea that the local is the global links to prefiguration, and the fact that the way to change the global and things like the global food system, rather than being through a top-down approach, is through a proliferation of small-scale and diverse self-governing communities. And in a lot of my work, I critique the kind of scaling up and gigantism as inherently authoritarian and destructive, contra some Marxist theorists of globalization like David Harvey. So many intentional communities practice federation through radical roots. I'm also interested in ideas around urban versus rural autonomy. So a lot of political and geographic theory privileges the urban as a radical site for transformation. Intentional communities can be both rural and urban, and both sites create different possibilities. So urban intentional communities often engage with wider struggles and political activity more, as I saw in London, speaking to members of intentional communities in London who were involved in a lot of urban social movements. Rural social movements often have more possibilities for self-management, for autonomy, ecological living, and so on. Intentional communities also often subvert the alienated division of urban from rural space through creative practices like urban farming and permaculture, primary goods and sustainable energy production, and self-management. Okay, so thinking about intentional community, that was some sort of theoretical concepts from my previous research on and with intentional communities, but thinking about intentional communities and food, what do they prefigure? And this obviously varies a lot by community. So as I said, I spoke in this research project, I did speak to one member of an intentional community who spoke about their experiences within the intentional community in relation to food. And it was a member of the Drive Housing Cooperative in Walthamstow, undertaken in summer 2023. So I've sorted this interview into some preliminary themes, and I'm also going to suggest some more themes for a broader analysis that I'd hope to undertake in later research. Okay, so there was a few ideas around collective consumption, sharing, and community. So my interviewee said, we all buy food together, and because of that, it's much better quality than I would eat, than I could afford if I lived alone. It's independent from the finance of the co-op. It's an arrangement we have amongst ourselves to buy food in bulk from a co-op, Suma, and also we have our food drop from Organically, the food producers co-op. We have a dinner board, which is a system where we display 2 weeks on a board and everyone's name, and we take turns to cook. Some people like cooking more than others. It means most evenings we eat together, whoever's around in the house, because not everyone always is, but there's nearly always food for those who are. Somebody's cooked a meal. I like cooking, and actually it's really nice because you cook something and people are going to eat it as a captive audience. There are also some ideas around food ethics and values, especially around animal ethics or vegetarianism, ecology and anti-capitalism. So this community did vegetarian cooking. We don't have meat, but some people are omnivore. So we have a fridge for people's own stuff when you don't want anyone else to have it. And then we have food storage for everyone. Rather than buy 6 little pots of peanut butter from the supermarket because it's easy, but actually why don't we buy a big container of, I don't know, 5 kilos from Suma because it's much less plastic. Sometimes we think through this, but sometimes we don't. For me, the thing about values is it's really important being in a place where I can see how I'm connected with other people, because I mean, that can go in different ways. For example, if I buy an avocado, it's not just for me, but it has an impact on the people that grow the avocado and vice versa. Our society is very much about hiding those things. That's okay. But I think actually if you live in a place like this, it makes it much more visible. So I think that's really important because then you can think differently and make different decisions if you actually understand those connections. Okay, so what do intentional communities prefigure? Just coming from those very short interview extracts, a slower, tastier and healthier relationship to food. So because the food cooking is shared, things like home cooking over processed and fast food, a more caring relationship between people, food, animals and ecosystems, building community through cooking and eating together, and also experimenting with self-sufficiency and reconfiguring and localizing the food system, which I think is probably the one most important thing that can be done to combat food insecurity. What do or might they contribute to a broader food justice and food sovereignty movement, or whatever discourse we want to use? Personally, I'm leaning towards the discourse on autonomous spaces and alternative food networks. But the language mostly used by my participants in this movement was food justice, and then some of them were using food sovereignty. Okay, so intentional communities can act as examples and inspiration for others. They can also act as spaces of radical knowledge building. So through, for example, consensus decision making, one of the things in the context of that quote about how food is connected to, we can see how food is more connected to others, is that discussions during consensus decision making would often bring different people's knowledges into the fray about that. So consensus decision making, consciousness raising and critical pedagogy around food are things that happen in intentional communities. Radical infrastructure building, so federation and supporting other groups through radical routes. Again, I think this is a really essential point about the importance of intentional communities as infrastructure, and how a proliferation of intentional communities would be a form of infrastructure building. Also connecting and participating with broader movements, because community life can open up space and time. So I think this is a reason that many of the people that I spoke to in this project, like a disproportionate number when thinking about just social movements in London or radical people in London, lived in intentional communities, partly to do with probably my networks and who I access people through, but also, I think it's to do with the fact that a lot of the people that made food during that participated in the food movements during COVID-19 were on furlough and so on, and they had to go back to their 9-to-5 jobs eventually, whereas a lot of people living in intentional communities, although many of them work, they don't always work full-time in the same way as people living in other ways in London do. So community life can open up space and time to participate in movements. Okay, so I mean, that's about it in terms of my presentation. I've got a slide here that tells about the documentary film we made, and there's a link which I'll make sure is distributed later. It's called The Social Life of Food, and we got the money to do it from the funding of the project, and the director is Matthias Kisper, who was a brilliant producer. And yeah, I had some ideas around things that I'd like to discuss. So obviously I'm open to any questions for me, but also I have some questions for the audience if they're willing to help me here, especially in terms of directions for further research. So what research do you think needs to be done on intentional communities and food? What similarities and differences exist between various intentional communities and their relationships to food? Do intentional communities have a role to play in fostering food justice, sovereignty and autonomy in a broader movement? And if so, how? And do they link to wider movements? Should they? Do they need to? What can be done here? And that's basically it.
Fantastic, thank you, Rhiannon. So we have good time now for some questions. Oh, everyone's clapping if you can't hear from the room, so thank you. We've got time for questions. And let's start with the audience in the room at Braziers Park. Does anyone have any questions there? And I can't quite remember, Kirsten, how you were imagining this was going to work.
Okay, so in the room in Braziers, you have a host sitting at the laptop, Jonathan, who is happy to take your questions, and he can either type them in, or if you're happy to voice them, he can turn on your audio for the period of the question itself. So you guys decide, but you get to go first.
So we're looking for both questions, Rhiannon, but also maybe some responses to the questions that she has asked us as well.
And if the room wants some thinking time, I've got a question which would be useful. So would that be?
Let's start with Kirsten, then we'll go to Jim, and then we'll come back to the audience in the room.
Thanks. Rhiannon, I saw loads of crossovers between the work that you're doing and some of the work that I've done in my research with intentional communities. So thank you. That was really interesting. I was just wondering about when you were saying about what is the role or what research should be done maybe in regards to food security. And my experience is that thing where in the intentional communities that I've visited, where they create and grow and produce and cook their own food, people are more not necessarily reverent and ceremonial, but they place food at the center. They're less likely to waste it. People will eat lettuce leaves which have got holes in them because they know how much effort it took to get to the plate. And it would probably be incredibly interesting. And I know a colleague of ours, Penny Clark, has done a little bit on this around food waste and food value and the centering of food. And I wondered whether you saw that in other autonomous spaces, the idea of this sort of centering of food because of the appreciation of how much effort it takes to get it to the plate.
I mean, one of the groups I worked with, which was absolutely wonderful, was Transition Leytonstone. And I won't go into too much detail because they play quite a big role in the documentary. So anyone who wants to see what they get up to can watch the documentary. But they rescued waste food from supermarkets. And they were like such inspirational people. You know, there was one woman there that was like 84 or something, and she was just amazing. And they went around supermarkets collecting waste, and they'd weigh it all so they know exactly what volume of food they were. Every last item got weighed and sort of tallied up, so they knew exactly what weight of food they were distributing to, like rescuing from waste and distributing to people. And they had this beautiful sort of architecture thing that somebody had built outside this. And the people that were it's like an informal food bank, basically, non-means tested. Anyone can turn up and get some food. And they just lay it out on Saturday mornings and fortnightly Sundays as well. And they just lay it out and just make it look absolutely beautiful for the people. You know, the people picking it up needed food. They were sort of desperate enough for food to queue for ages and get free food that would have gone in the bin otherwise. But the people that were distributing this food made it look absolutely beautiful. You know, they picked through the fruit to get rid of the one that wasn't good enough, and you know, they'd wear gloves when handling everything to, you know, make it safe. And they just made it look absolutely gorgeous, you know, so that the people could come and have an experience that was like picking food from a supermarket. And you know, choosing what they wanted to make their meals with and things. So yeah, it's on the documentary, so you can see. But yeah, there was certainly a reverence about food there, and sort of appreciating the food and making it beautiful, and things like that. But yeah, I totally agree, and I have done a lot of research with intentional communities that eating is sort of central to everything, and community life, and building sort of life. And it's the same in a lot of communities, really, how food is sort of such an important part of the social and building the social. So I think that's why I was surprised that I wasn't able to interview more people sort of as members of intentional communities, if you see what I mean. People were more interested in talking about, I think that's partly because I did the project as a London project, so I was interested in movements in London, so I didn't have many rural groups, which I think might have made a big difference. But it was a sort of small pilot project with a small budget, so it's something that I want to expand and bid for more if anyone wants to come on and bid with me as well. That's another thing.
Thank you. Over to Jim.
Thanks, Rhiannon. That was really interesting, and it just got me thinking. I was thinking about another possible thread in terms of research or reaching out to groups. Apologies if I missed anything on this. I was just chopping for dinner behind me, so I was sort of in and out. But I was just wondering, in terms of it talked a lot about the distribution and the consumption of food within intentional communities, but I think only one use of the F word in your presentation being farming. And I just wondered, groups like community supported agriculture, I don't know any or much about groups in the UK. I was quite involved in some in Germany back in the day when we were, me and my wife were a distribution point for one. And I was struck by how the people who were actually doing farming at relatively small scale were quite, I think abused is probably too strong a word, but were not recognized by the community supporting group as having a need to be properly paid and supported, and most importantly housed. And the reason I'm kind of thinking around this is one of the biggest issues in keeping small scale farming going and supporting it in rural communities is housing. Housing is the issue that we'll come back to everywhere. And I wonder if there's a route in through looking at community supported agriculture groups and potential links, or even existing links, who knows, with rural housing supplied and created by CLTs, by community land trusts. It seems to me a link that it perhaps exists, but definitely should exist. We know examples of community land trusts who provide housing for key workers, and I can think of an example in Dorset where there's a group who provide accommodation for local health workers. But I'm just wondering if small-scale farmers should be seen in that context as well, and whether there's any scope or possibility for that. It's just a thread, really. I'm kind of thinking aloud.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. It's not, I'm a bit out my depth with commenting on it because it's not really my area, but certainly community land trusts are a great thing. Yeah, I'm not sure what to
Sure. I'm maybe it's just one that I'm flagging, and I can follow up with some links to you, just some thoughts on.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Maybe
Yeah,
I need to do a
bit out
little
of my
bit
area,
of
but it
research
sounds
then.
really interesting. One of the groups in the documentary is a community farm in London, but it looks like it's in the countryside. It's beautiful, and they're sort of growing vegetables, and they rely on a variety of funding models and volunteers and things like that. But yeah, I haven't really thought through the links to housing, I'm afraid.
Sure.
Thank you. If I can take Chair's prerogative and ask a question, if that would be all right. Oh, have you got one in the audience?
Yeah, we have. Yeah.
Allow you jump in first, and then. Okay, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Phoenix. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. So much really incredible information there. So I've been involved with a lot of movements over a lot of years, run a lot of social centres and squatting movement now to Climate Emergency Centres Network. I suppose one of my questions that came up while you were talking is about, do you reference within the report or the film about access to land? And something I spoke to a East African woman at a climate summit years ago, and she was talking about what we actually really want is food sovereignty. All these big corporations are coming and buying our land. So, I mean, obviously there's a terrible land distribution in this country, worse than Brazil, where something like 5% of the population owns 75% of the land. Is there any reference in what you're doing? We're involved with like The Land Is Ours and other groups like that, to land access and access to land. And brilliant work. Keep it up. That's great.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I completely agree with you that access to land is one of the sort of fundamental issues. And I think just access to space generally is sort of what all this stuff is all about, really. But as I said, it's quite a limited project. It's quite a small pilot project, and it was based just within London. So the issues were more about sort of access to buildings and things like that people are worried about, rather than access to land, because it's very much within the urban, if you see what I mean. But yeah, though I did spend, there was a growers cooperative. I suppose the difficulty with doing a sort of sociological project like this is you're interviewing people that are doing what they're doing. So the people I spoke to already had access, that were growing already had access to land, if you see what I mean. But yeah, it's obviously a topic that's going to come up in a broader project, and thank you for reminding me of the importance of it. Yeah, I mean, I often think about sort of access to in urban projects like this. I often think about access to spaces like squatting. How do people occupy space, and is it secure or temporary, and the different kind of compromises and negotiations that go on with sort of access to space, in the sense that people that have more permanent residences, it's often either because it's a historic, especially in London, it's often either because it's a historical thing, because historically that building was bought decades ago, so you know it's quite a privilege, or they're under constant threat of hike to rents or whatever. And then at the extreme end of that scale is squatted spaces, which are very temporary. And I think, you know, there's but yeah, I think in a broader project that looked beyond London, then access to land would definitely be a central and fundamental issue. But I mean, yeah, I think also access to land to grow. I hadn't actually thought a huge amount about that. I did speak to like one of the people in the documentary is at Sutton Community Farm, which is kind of out of London, and I can't remember how they might say in the documentary, I can't remember how they initially got their land.
Just a quick come back there, just say on this Climate Emergency Centre network we're doing, there's a recipe on the website how to access spaces and buildings for free on a temporary basis. And also I think Hull and other groups are working on a community right to grow. The council's actually said that people can access council land and grow, and it's talking about spreading around the country, I think. Oh,
brilliant. I just thought of a really interesting example that came out of my research. Actually, was one group called Time to Grow, and they basically set up people in the local area who have gardens but don't have time to garden, or they don't have the ability to garden, with people that wanted to grow food. So there's this whole network of people with kind of spare gardens that didn't have time to look after, which are then matched with people who want to grow food, and then the grown food is sort of either they get to keep some because it's their garden, and then it's distributed via, there's a sort of cooperative cafe near me that distributes food, and then some of it's, yeah, there's all sorts of interesting things that this food then gets used for. But yeah, lots of food being grown in people's gardens I thought was a really interesting concept in a kind of suburban area.
We've got another question here, Jenny.
Yeah, great, go ahead.
Yeah.
Hiya. Yeah, thanks a lot for the chat. It's been really, really interesting. I have a little bit of a different perspective from an intentional community of about 300 households in the northeast Scotland. And yeah, I would just say that in some intentional communities, the food system is fairly low in the whole prioritization of place-based issues. So for instance, in this community, all of the food waste from households go into the brown bin and get sent back to the council, because otherwise there would be rats. there's just, they do a call out for volunteers because there is the space to grow things. But that is just not, they struggle with retention, they struggle with training. And yeah, it's just adding that complexity in there, really. That there's, like Jim pointed out, the housing, in my experience, the housing crisis, the cost of living crisis, and also the aging population really takes precedence, especially in rural intentional communities. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just add a couple of things, if that would be all right? Thank you. I've put one, let me try and say it briefly, Rhiannon, because I know we're going to move on to Kirsten first. The first is, just building on that last comment, Sky Blue in the US has written quite a provocative letter to the intentional communities, critiquing them. And there've been some really good discussions since about how intentional communities should do more in broader social change. And it's quite confrontational, but it's meant, with love. He comes from the movement. So I put a link to that because I think it does relate to this second, that sort of point of, there's a big difference in intentional communities between providing for yourselves and being part of a food justice movement, which to me requires a different act. And I just want to advertise Julia Spanier's work, building on Jim's work. She's just finished a PhD on community-supported agriculture and post-capitalism, very anarchisty and very interested in how community-supported agriculture, often attached to intentional communities, which they often are, can bridge the divide between the rural and the urban and create new relations around food in a post-capitalist society. And so I'd really encourage engagement with that literature as well, because I probably should have started, Rhiannon, because I always dive in too much, which loving it. This is great. And I've got 1,000 questions, which I won't bore everyone with, but this sounds really interesting work. But I do think it taps into that need for what capacity is there for broader social change in intentional communities? And then what does that look like in terms of how solidarity is put in practice? And of course, community-supported agriculture, although it offers post-capitalism, what it's really offering is a way to support rural farming and having some benefit to the consumers. But actually, it's almost going the other way to what you're suggesting. Not sure there was a question in there, but please respond if you want to.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting what you mentioned about how intentional community, like the relationship between intentional communities and broader food justice, isn't necessarily something that sort of easily translates like that, or it might be I can't remember, there was one thing you said. What did you say about that I sort of,
that there's basically that I think intentional communities often, if they are focused on food, are very good at self-provision, but struggle just in terms of capacity to turn that into those more mutual aid food networks beyond their boundaries. Okay. And that's what Sky Blue is critiquing. And
I think that was exactly the reason why some of the people I spoke to didn't want to be interviewed about being in intentional communities, because they just didn't see what they were doing. They didn't see their life in an intentional community or experiences in an intentional community as contributing to a broader food movement, even though they were present and contributing to this broader food movement. So yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, in a way, I feel like I did speak to a disproportionate number of people from intentional communities who were involved in this food movement, and it might just be, that might be a sort of particularity of the area in London that I live in and the people that I ended up speaking to and things like that. But I think especially, in London, people in intentional communities are more involved in sort of radical social justice projects than people who, just don't live like that. So yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm going to have to read this literature though and engage with it, as you say. So that's a really helpful recommendation. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, and I will move us on, but it's not a critique, Rhiannon. Actually, I think what Julia does in her work is make the claim that community-supported agriculture and intentional communities don't realise what they're offering to post-capitalism.
Right. Okay.
So she's got quite similarly, a lot of them talk down what they did well,
Yeah.
we just do this. And she's saying that they've actually got huge potential, and she suggests that they link better with the degrowth movement as a result.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'd completely agree with that point as well, because I think even just by doing things differently at a different scale, you know, the problem with the food system that everyone that I spoke to was identifying in terms of things like choke points and how you can't change the food system because ultimately it's all coming through a sort of, you know, very, you know, small number of particular capitalist distributors, and it's very hard to change that. And to me, like, degrowth and localization would absolutely be the only way to change that, I think.
I'm conscious of time, so I just want to thank Rhiannon. Please do get in touch with her if you've got any more questions or you'd like to talk to her more. She's easily findable online, and she's at UCL. So thank you. I'm now going to move us on and introduce Kirsten Stevens-Wood. It's my great privilege to introduce Kirsten, who I have now been working with for a good number of years. And she's going to talk about her recently completed, congratulations, PhD on experimentation in intentional communities. And I don't know if you're going to touch on aging today, Kirsten, or I'll hand it over to you. You've got 20 minutes.
Thank you. I do have some slides to share, but it was just to listening to Rhiannon's talk. I'm just very much struck by the numbers. It's almost like a sort of web of all the links that connect all of the different things that we're doing over the next few days. And you know, these ideas of autonomous spaces feeds into some of the ideas that I'm going to present in my presentation around whether or not intentional communities kind of provide a space that allows us to be experimental, that isn't available maybe outside, or that they are a form of autonomous space. So, you know, there's a direct link, I think, between the work that that Rhiannon's talking about, even though it's about food, and mine is more about kind of decision making and experimentation. But actually, those ideas around being able to do something that's different and something that has different parameters than the norm is that commonality. So I'm going to have a go at sharing my slides. I need permission to share my slides, I think, Jonathan, and then I will.
I think you've got it.
Okay, it says sharing is not turned on.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
You can request the host to allow multiple sharing.
Oh, Lord. Right. Okay. Well, I'd already done it.
That's okay. I can just talk.
Yeah, carry on talking then.
Okay, I will. So I'm going to be, I basically had to make a decision. So I did my PhD. I've just kind of gone over the line, but for those of you who've done it in the past, you'll know that the last line is one of many. So this piece of research was actually carried out around about 5 years ago, and it was with a single, large, steady, well-established intentional community in the UK.
Click on the arrow.
One of the things I'm going to do in advance is apologise for the lack of, nope, still can't share, for the lack of images in there. And part of that's because I did take photos, but I didn't disclose the location of my community in my writing. And although the community, I met with them actually about 2 weeks ago online and presented my work back to them, and they all seem to be very interested and wanting to share it as something. I've got it now, Jonathan, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
We didn't actually have that conversation about whether or not I would kind of change it to the point where I would tell people who they are. So I've now got a load of stock photographs on my presentation, and you'll have to forgive me, I suppose. So essentially, the thing that was the driving force for me with my presentation was this idea of what I'm calling experimentality. And that's the idea that I was really struck by the idea that every time I went to a different intentional community, I could see that there were really interesting things happening, either in terms of kind of like decision making or just testing stuff out. Historically, I could see that things like straw bale building was intentional communities were early uptakers of things like that. And I was like, wow, is there something going on here that is available to people in intentional communities that isn't available or isn't accessible outside of that? So I've got to get to my next slide now, and it's not letting me just do it through return. So let me see. Oh, here we go. So I started to use this word quite early on called experimentality. And I was really annoyed because I Googled it and it came up with absolutely nothing. And I tried to look into to find literature, and I found very, very little. But what I did do was I managed to kind of weave something out of it. So I'm putting that in red because I'm going to revisit it in a minute, because I want to look at the idea of experimentality. But I set out to explore this as a phenomenon within an intentional community, and to look at the ways in which a community holds a space. So it's not necessarily that a community is like constantly being innovative, or, everybody's always experimenting with everything. It's more the thinking about it in terms of being what we call an autonomous space, or a space that has independence outside of what we might call the mainstream, although I know a lot of people don't use that term, which allows it to have the opportunity for creativity and innovation. And that, like I said, my starting point really was that, from having visited lots of intentional communities, both in the UK and also as a woofer abroad in Spain predominantly, but also France, I could see that there was things going on that perhaps were facilitated by this idea of kind of communal living, and that sometimes ideas emerged, and I thought, well, there must be something there. And that was sort of framed the very starting of my PhD. And like I said, I saw lots of things like strawberry building, people growing. So drawing on some of the things that Rhiannon's talked about, people actually attempting things like self-sufficiency, people playing with the ideas of multiple family units or non-familial relationships, non-nuclear households. All of those things were kind of spiking my interest and making me think, well, this is definitely something I would like to explore. So coming back to this term of experimentality, and like I said, I Googled initially experimentality and found very, very little. And then my second sort of idea was, well, I'm going to go into sort of some of the more academic search engines. And again, I found some really kind of loose and not particularly well formed descriptions. But one I really did like that I found was an art gallery that had left their space empty for an entire year, and they called it the Experimentality Project. And the idea was that people could come in and they could use the space as and when they wanted, and they could put up art, take down art, play with art, they could do pop-ups and things like that. And I was like, yeah, that feels very much like the thing I want to think about, this idea of holding a space open so that things can happen, or things can take place within it. And sometimes they will, and sometimes they won't. So I was like, right, okay. So for me, it was that kind of like that idea of what we might call processorial. I always get it wrong. This idea of kind of ongoing and contextualized creativity and experimentation. So not necessarily happening like an experiment with a beginning and a middle and an end, but this idea that it kind of got embedded within a community, or within a group of people, or within autonomous space. And so I had this understanding of experimentality, that it wasn't so much the experimental process, but more a way of thinking about it and considering how intentional communities, and actually as an extension of that, other autonomous spaces, might or might not foster experimentation. And so I was taking these ideas with me. So I as with all pieces of research, you kind of write this proposal and this idea of I'm going to go in and I'm going to have a look and see what goes on. So it seemed obvious to me that my method was going to be ethnography. So ethnography, for those of you who perhaps are not immersed in these things, is this idea of kind of being a participant observer. Quite often there are different ethnographies, but ethnographers quite often roll their sleeves up and get involved in the worlds in which they are researching. So there's some, you know, very interesting examples of people who've done things like saunas or sweat rooms and lodges, or they might even have done tea dances or other alternative spaces. So I approached the community that I would like to observe and participate, and they very generously opened their doors to me. So my study period spanned around about six, it was actually nearer to 7 in the end, months in the life of the community. I came and went, so obviously I went home sometimes. I'm an active lecturer, which means I have a commitment to work and I have a family. But whilst I was there, I really was embedded in the life of the community, which meant I lived there, I ate with them, I worked, I cooked food, I slept in the community, and essentially attempted to live as close to living as a member of that community as I could, and at the same time with the community having the knowledge that I was researching. So I wasn't, you know, it wasn't secret research. It was people knew I was researching. So days were quite long. They quite often started at 7 because this community grew food and kept animals and had quite a lot of land and huge amounts of work to do. And sometimes ended after 9, especially during the summer when it was light all day. And then I came and went over 3 periods of time. So I stayed for around about 3 weeks. So I think I did like autumn, sort of September, October, and then I did a sort of February, March, and then an April, May, if I remember rightly. And in all of those times, I was able to watch the seasons change, the tasks in the community. So in the summer, you know, bringing in all of the huge amounts of food and preservation. And then in the other months, perhaps the focus would be entirely different. And in all of that time, I'm kind of interviewing people and asking questions, and you know, it's kind of going, you know, how do you think it, you know, would you consider this place to be experimental? What was your experience? How did you find it? And of course, I created this enormous amount of data, like a mind-blowing amount of data in the end. And I got to the point where myself and my supervisors were like, no, don't do any interviews. You don't need to do any more. You know, we have it coming out of our ears. And the next stage of that was like, well, what do I do with all of this data? And so it was a case of literally creating this huge kind of mind map of all of the different things that people were saying and the things I was observing and the things that people were telling me that their understanding of events and the events that I was observing myself. And then I managed to kind of sort this out into 3 of these main themes. And the things that, according to my research, and obviously someone else could go in there and find something entirely different, was that there were these 3 kind of main themes that came up whenever we started to talk about, well, what makes communities open or closed actually to experimentation and experimentality. And the first one was this idea of decision making. So not just, so we had formal decision making, which came in the form of consensus. So, you know, meetings, everybody sitting in a room, proper agendas, everybody making it explicit. But then it fairly quickly became apparent that there was also this kind of like other level of decision making, which was decision making that took place outside of the meeting, and also the ways in which ideas knocked around within the decision making processes and sometimes got kind of kicked out of the field or were sidestepped or didn't get analysed in the way that the decision making process for that community was really wanting or on paper had described it. And I came to kind of like, I kind of went, well, how does this impact on experimentation? And it was coming down to these factors of saying that, well, actually experimentation is altered, and it's altered by the sorts of things like the collective nature of decision making. It slows it down. Now, interestingly, when I asked people about this, there was a real mixed opinion about the slowing it down. There's some people were adamant that slowing it down was good. So I haven't put the quotes in here actually, but I remember, and I've written about it, that I had one person who said, you know what, Kirsten, slowing down the decision making is really good, because when we commit to something, you know, we have to, 50 to 60 people have to commit to this. And therefore we have to make proper decisions, and it has to be a slow process so that everybody can get an opportunity to think about it. And then other people were quite irritated about it and said, you know, things take forever, things get batted back, they don't always make it through the decision-making process. And some people found that quite frustrating. And I think it led to that second part, which said that actually decision-making in groups, especially around things that perhaps entail experimentation, so choices that quite often entailed change or to some degree maybe risk, demands agreement. It demands that everybody is on board with it. And for those of you who are familiar with consensus, you know, everybody to some degree has some sort of level of buy-in to that. And I also found in my research that when thinking of decision making through the lens of experimentation, is that quite often consensus or formalized decision making can be quite resistive to change and leans towards the status quo. So some examples of that were quite often new members would come in, they'd be very exuberant, they'd want to enact their new ideas, make things happen, be very active in the community, and then they throw their ideas into the decision-making process. And it would slowly make its way through this process, and slowly kind of all the corners would get knocked off, and it would be kind of shrunk and changed, and people would find that really difficult. And the status quo, so if there was already an agreement to, say, for example, I don't know, that if the example was that the community wanted to get goats, and that then people would come in and say, well, we've had goats before, you know, it didn't work, they broke out, they ate all the food in the polytunnel in 1968. And this would also impact on the decision making, which would then impact on the creativity. The second thing that I came across was this idea, and it was quite complex to unpick because I had this huge amount of data and all of these different kind of things coming in. I was going, well, is it because people are getting older, or is it because the community is getting older collectively, or is it just a factor of the passing of time? And I kept having these conversations with people about something I kept calling the ship of Theseus, this idea of a boat that leaves and they replace the mast, and then a year later they replace the side bit, and then they put the new something else in. And by the time it comes back round and returns to the country it set off from, no part of that ship is the same ship. And I was thinking it's something like this. But I think what I was looking at was this really tight interaction between people aging, so people changing their priorities as they went from being in their 30s and their 40s and having children and raising children and possibly taking risks and feeling happy about taking risks. I mean, crumbs, setting up a community where you're, you know, buying collectively is a huge risk. And by the time I joined this community, they were in the community itself was in its 45th year, and they had started to become more risk averse. And that had come both with the passing of time. They were more secure, they had paid off a lot of their debts. They didn't necessarily have any particular debts around their housing, but also that the people themselves were aging collectively. And it seemed to bring about this blockage in terms of experimentation, where people were more reluctant to be experimental because they wanted to, there was more preferencing of security over risk taking. certain amounts of embedded practices. We've always done it this way, which came back to the decision making, and this emergence of a form of kind of collective path dependency. These things have been set up in this way, and therefore we are committed to continuing carrying out these things in these ways, because what has gone before is now shaping the present and the future. And then the last one was this idea of purpose and collective vision. And I found this one to be really interesting, because when I was talking about experimentation, quite often people would say, oh, well, there's, you know, it's really hard to get something done here. You know, it's really hard to kind of push through an idea, a big idea, you know, and I was like, well, why do you think that is? And ultimately, this particular community, I found it was really interesting, and I've seen this again and again since I've done my ethnography, is that people have an idea of what the purpose of a community is. So in this particular case, there was a certain group or a collection of people who, if you ask them what the priority for their community was, they would say very clearly, our priority is self-sufficiency. It's to grow as much food as we can, and to live on that food and have a good life in terms of, like, you know, sustainability and self-sufficiency. And then you'd ask another couple of people, not necessarily even together, you know, in different parts, and they say, no, we're here, we're caretakers of the land. We're here, we you know, our priority is environmentalism. It's about caring for biodiversity. It's about looking after the land we have and having a very small footprint, you know, not consuming, making sure we recycle and that we're responsible. And then the last group would say, no, our priority is we're a community. We're here to value human beings, to be communities, to value relationships. And I realized about halfway through that what was one of the factors that was happening was that the divergent understandings of the different priorities was causing issues in the decision making, because people were making decisions according to their understanding of the purpose and collective vision of what their understanding of the community was. And what that also did was it lowered confidence in the decision-making process, because people didn't feel that their decisions were being valued. And that also the day-to-day, so the making of the food, the harvesting, the caring for the land, was kind of overshadowing the long-term picture stuff. So those were three really interesting themes. And from that, I'm just keeping an eye on my time, Jenny, I ended up with 9 findings. Now, I don't have time to talk about 9 findings, but I do want to highlight, having said all of these things, the one thing that kind of came back to me right at the very end. And that really was that the act of living in an intentional community is in and of itself an experimental thing to do. So the act of living community is an ongoing and lived experiment. And I just, you know, it's like I did a huge piece of research and I kind of came full circle all the way to the end. And I thought, yeah, the fact that people are prepared to put their lot in with others, to think about their needs collectively, to be prepared to consider other people's well-being and thoughts and priorities in concert with their own and others, is in and of itself experimental and you know, sort of a pretty amazing thing to do. So that was my number one. And then I had 8 other findings, which I'm never going to find enough time to talk about, and I haven't even attempted. But the things that I found was that decision-making in groups with long-term relationships is dynamically different from decision-making in, say, profit incentivized companies or even non-profit incentivized companies, because it's decision-making in groups that know each other, that have relationships with each other and have ongoing relationships with each other. The third one was that decision-making that isn't profit incentivized, so that isn't about maximizing anything, creates different types of experimental opportunities. So quite often experimentation would centre itself around preserving things, or about making things fun even, or about enhancing people's lives, as opposed to making profits or squeezing more from less. And that led me into this idea of non-hierarchical organizations, that you know, non-hierarchical organizations initiate change through what we call distributed responsibility. And unfortunately, what that also does is it offers more opportunity for non-decision making. So this idea that there isn't anybody at the end of that process who goes, right, this is what we're doing. It's a good thing because it's distributed and it's, you know, it's fair and it's slow, but it also has that loophole in it, which I observed in my PhD about this non-decision making. Things can slide and they can escape the decision making process. The number 5 was this day-to-day, you know, the idea that being busy and always being busy can sometimes overshadow time and space for experimentation. And number 6 was that long-term embedded forms of experimentation are what are called both big C. So big C is usually like in things that find their way out into the greater world. It might be straw bale building, it might be using solar, it might be district heating systems, those sort of like those things that are then find their way out into the big world. And also little c, it might be fixing a latch on a gate so that it makes a noise when it opens, or it might be just something quite small but significant that happens from somebody being able to fiddle around with something. Number 7 said that internal experimentation is harder as communities become more stable and secure. And I use the example in my research of comparing it against younger communities who were still finding their way. And although they were finding it difficult, they were quite often forced to be more experimental in order to find funding for things, or to fill gaps, or to make things work. And that led on to this idea of bureaucracy, which is useful in terms of parameters and guidelines, but then also constrains and inhibits. And then the last one, which I am hoping to write quite a lot more about, is this idea of collective temporalities, so shared experiences of time and the passing of time and the impact that that has on experimentality. So overall, I would say, as I said before, that intentional communities as autonomous spaces are supportive environments for experimentality, but that there are factors that may slow it down, sidestep, or get in the way of it. And things that might help are things like revisiting goals, processes, and policies regularly and openly, and also reopening opportunities for experimentation, creativity, and innovation. Thank you. I have to
Thank
find
you,
the button.
Kirsten. You might not have heard all the clapping, but there has been lots of clapping.
Thank
Great.
you.
We've got some minutes for questions now. Anyone like to start us off? And I can't actually see everyone. Kirsten, yeah, perfect. Anyone want to start us off in the room, or?
Yeah, we've got somebody here.
Brilliant.
Hi, Kirsten. That was really fascinating. My mind is whirling after hearing your talk. I had a question for you about process. So as you were exploring how experimentation happens within the community, was it part of a defined process, or was it just something that kind of happened spontaneously? And the basis for my question, I'm a researcher that works with designers a lot and observes the design process. And experimentation has a place in that process that's like really quite well defined. So it's, you know, you prototype, you test, you learn, you iterate, etc. And it's, you know, it's it kind of has a reserved space for it in that sense as part of an overall process. Was there something like that going on, or was it more kind of free flowing in terms of how it operates within the community?
That's a really good question. I think I think the when we talk about, one of my supervisors for my PhD was from a psychology background. So she was in the School of Psychology at my university. And when she read my chapter on experimentation, she said, this is so different to her understanding. So coming from psychology, there's this idea of kind of like having I don't know what they're called, test groups, you know, so you compare one group with the other, you have you have samples, and it's all very controlled. And she said that, you know, there's just what you're describing to me is it's very out of control or non-controlled. And I said, yeah, I said it's different, you know, it's probably lives further into the world of kind of art and design than it does in the world of psychology and control groups and things like that. And I think that intentional communities don't necessarily set out to be experimental. A lot of people set out to create something that they would probably call a better way of life. And I think that kind of links in with what Rhiannon was talking about with this idea of prefiguration, the idea of trying to create the change that you would like to see. So creating an environment where, I don't know, where people eat together regularly, where it doesn't matter hugely whether you put in as much as your neighbour did, but that you care to some degree that you are all contributing to something which creates a bigger whole. And I guess that coming back to the idea of experimentation, that is the experiment. The experiment is, and it's ongoing, is how do we set up a way of living together that suits us, and each one will be different, and we can meet needs, and we can also test out other things. And I see intentional communities doing amazing things that society hasn't done. I see intentional communities having conversations about how they can meet the needs of their elders, or how they might be able to incorporate people who don't have any money. Or how they might be able to make spaces available for people with disabilities or mental health issues. Not always, but I have seen those conversations taking place all the time. And I think those are all of those are sort of social experiments. So they're quite hard to fit within the sort of the design field, because they don't necessarily, they're not necessarily coming from the same direction. I'm not sure that answered your question. I'm actually here at Braziers, so if you want to find me, come and find me after.
Oh, I will do. I'd love to talk to you more about this.
Okay.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question. Tom?
Oh, hi there, Kirsten. I really enjoyed that. And I almost don't know where to start. I think it's the start of a very long conversation, because my personal view is that every intentional community is so different, but actually somehow I think you found some universals in amongst, from your research. But I'm just wondering if you have it in yourself, or maybe you could send some of your own PhD students to replicate the research somewhere else, embedded in other communities maybe, and check if your 9 findings are actually as universal as they appear to be emerging. Because my experience of co-housing, I'm seeing quite a lot of other co-housing groups, is that there's a fantastic spectrum between conservatism with all sorts of capital or not capital C's and risk aversion to quite experimental sort of stuff that's and I don't think it's age related. I think, for example, in the community here, the older people are up for it, and a lot of the younger people are just in for somewhere nice to live.
Tom, I am very much in accord with you. In fact, it is written into my PhD that in the particular community that I was researching, there were people in their 70s and 80s who were more physically active and contributing for lots of reasons. I mean, actually, one of the reasons was because the younger people were were having to make a living. But age wasn't necessarily the dividing line in terms of contribution or even activity. It was
or
yeah,
attitude.
No, not at all. Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, I did a presentation, I think about 2 years ago, which I can't remember, but it was something about the boomers haven't finished yet. You know, the underpinning philosophy was that all of those people who were in their 20s and 30s in the 1960s are still breaking ground and doing interesting things. And quite a lot of them are in co-housing.
Still hoping for the revolution to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. I'm slightly conscious of time, and just to remind everyone that Kirsten is at Braziers Park this weekend, so if you're around and you want to chat more. And also just hearing you talk, Kirsten, I wonder if there's like an opportunity for a toolkit that helps communities explore their experimentality as well, but we can maybe chat over that another time. I'm going to now introduce our third speaker, Bruno Friedel, please correct my pronunciation, who is a researcher at Oxford University and is going to talk to us today about his work on co-housing and its relation to land. So I think we'll touch on some really interesting common themes across these. So over to you.
Definitely. Thank you. Now I'll just share my screen. All right, there we go. Yeah, well, thanks very much for being here and great to be presented to this symposium. My focus through my PhD has been on co-housing groups in Australia and the UK, and in particular their relationships to land. I've been looking at how groups find land, how they acquire it, how they organise themselves, and also some of the planning challenges that they face in relation to land. Today, I want to build on that work and talk about what we can learn from the use of land by co-housing communities. So this is the research question that I'll be looking at today. It's from a paper that I'm writing at the moment, so the observations I'll be discussing are quite fresh. So of course, any thoughts and observations are very, very welcome. I'm focusing on this question in what ways does the collective use of land by co-housing groups help inform new understandings and uses of urban land, particularly in a time of ecological crisis. So I've been looking at co-housing groups in the UK and Australia, some of which you already may be familiar with, and I just saw Tom there from On the Brink. There's a mixture of groups that have been established for 20 to 30 years. Some have only just finished construction, others are in the construction phase, and one group is in formation and attempting to secure land. I've focused my study on co-housing groups in urban areas, not because I think that some of the phenomena that I'll discuss are not evident in rural co-housing groups, but I had to draw the line somewhere, and also I think issues with land are perhaps more pronounced in urban areas. So I've done interviews with co-housing group members from all these groups. I'll be presenting some of the anonymised quotes from these interviews to help break down the question they pose. So first, I wanted to look at how members of co-housing communities talk about the land that they're situated on. So a few different themes came up in my discussion. So the first theme could be seen as the refuge that many find from living collectively on land, what that provides in terms of the ability to grow food, again, a common theme from today, share resources and rely on bonds of a strong network. While this quote here could suggest a certain withdrawal from the troubles that are ongoing in the world, the interviewee here and the community discussed were quite outward looking and keen to think about how the collective knowledge that the community had, particularly on things like renewable energy, could be shared with their surrounding neighbourhood. For example, they were discussing running film nights or information sessions for their neighbours. But of course, with the benefits of a large block of land, the responsibilities that need to be shared. Even in urban areas, some of the communities I talked to had a lot of land. This particularly speaks to the Australian, I think, context. So those responsibilities maybe include how to plant responsibly, thinking about the biodiversity that the land is part of, and how the land may change over time. The use of consensus decision-making is a key part of this, obviously, and alongside anything else that needs to be codified. It's interesting with this group in question that there's a degree of flexibility in how they see the use of private versus shared land, and that there is some give in their agreements in a way. That sort of private land, for example, a small front garden on one part of the co-housing community could perhaps be turned back into shared space based on the particular capacities of that person over the longer term. So these are two photos from Co-Housing Cooperative in Hobart, Tasmania, also known as Litchfield. They're a community that's about 10-15 minutes from the centre of Hobart. But as you can see from the photo on the left and the right, they have quite a significant bit of land. It's quite bushy and requires maintenance, particularly in terms of bushfire protection. But as you can see, it's absolutely beautiful, and they back onto the side of a mountain, Kanani. Its colonial name is Mount Wellington. So another theme that came up in discussions was an alternative approach to how housing occupied space on land. A lot of co-housing developments necessarily emphasise houses with smaller footprints than the norm, with shared spaces obviously compensating for loss of private space. But from what I've seen, this is not about extracting what you can from a dense space in a way that cramps the design that might typify a conventional for-profit development. Co-housing communities obviously think deeply about how the shared spaces are central to the whole design. And of course, co-housing schemes are efficient on land in other ways, for example, through reductions in car parking. One scheme I looked at was able to build 30 homes where a conventional development would have fitted 20, simply because of the reductions in car parking. The communities I spoke to were all concerned about the long-term health of what they had built together, and were keen to ensure that it would carry on for future generations with the fundamental principles intact. I think this echoes co-housing developments from perhaps the first wave of the model that maybe existed since the 1960s or earlier, and may have multiple generations of family move through it, including through some children growing up and then moving into a house in the same community. Of course, this resilience speaks to the importance of the organisational model that the co-housing community might have, particularly in terms of tenure, which I'll talk a bit more about later. But beyond this, I'm really interested here in this particular quote about the sort of connection and unity and thinking between the community over the longer term and the actual physical soil that underpins them. As you might expect, I've taken a lot of photos of co-housing gardens, and this, I guess, again, sort of links into just some of the discussion today. On the left is the garden of Chapeltown Co-housing in Leeds. And indeed, with Chapeltown, the land required significant remediation work before they could build and indeed garden on it. And then on the right is a more established garden from Cascode Co-housing. So in my discussions with co-housing communities, both new and old, one theme that came up was the relationship between private and shared space. Of course, every community will have slightly different understandings, some of them codified, others more informal. But one interesting observation was the idea that communities needed to continually keep an open dialogue about where the private ended and the shared began. This is particularly in the case of new residents joining who may not have been around when agreements were originally made. As one example, this is a co-housing community which has houses on both sides of a pedestrianised street with cars kept to the perimeter. These are small private gardens at the front of homes before giving way to the shared pedestrian street. where the small front gardens end and the street begins, means a slight shift in the responsibilities. Because whilst these are not major issues, they're nonetheless fundamental to the use of the space in the community. Of course, it's worth emphasising that in all the co-housing communities I visited, that there are strong agreements about the prioritisation of shared space. For example, in the ability of kids to play openly, and for productive spaces like gardens for vegetables. So next, I just want to speak about the methods and structures that co-housing communities use to support their approach to land. And so this again goes back to a common theme. The ability to make agreements was cited as an important skill in co-housing groups. As these quotes suggest, in co-housing communities, there's a certain element of the social design of co-housing that ensures that people have to negotiate and come to agreements with others. That idea that here we're at home, and when we step outside our door, there's that person that we potentially might have an ongoing conflict with. Many groups have obviously developed long-standing ways to come to consensus, and these may be carried forward from the inception of the group right through to the establishment of the community. There's, however, I think perhaps maybe a tricky shift from one phase of a community to another, in moving from making agreements about elements about where they could live, what the build could look like, to perhaps more day-to-day arrangements about how they would share land and resources, and perhaps in the sense sort of learning much more about each other in earnest. One group pointed out to me that what they developed over the period of 20 years in terms of consensus making was really important civic skills that they carried out into their world. And this was passed on to spaces that they used outside of the community. Sorry. Okay. A number of the co-housing communities, oh, sorry, I've skipped a slide, I think. No, I didn't, that's okay. A number of the co-housing communities I visited were cooperatives, which meant that residents were members of an organisation that owned at least 1% of every home, and also owned the land and the common house. In this case, each resident is a member of the cooperative and has an equal say in the management of the cooperative. I like the nuance sort of expressed in, sorry, it's this quote here. I really like the nuance expressed in this quote, a feeling of the empowerment that comes from the equity stake. In this case, 25% ownership, but then the connection to the shared sense of ownership. I think this is a really refreshing approach to ownership, and brings out that notion of stewardship over the wider land and community. So I think there's a role, I think, also for nominal equity models as well. So I looked at both limited equity and nominal equity models. Like, we can talk about that, perhaps. I don't want to get down too much into the weeds of it, but I think we have to recognise that some people will be happy to not leave with anything, but that we need to nonetheless provide them with stability and empower their cooperative models just the same. In the case of this group, they were a nominal equity cooperative, so in a sense, a full rental cooperative, which are pretty common in Australia. I think here it's a sort of profound expression that runs against sort of conventional thinking in terms of how we treat the land and properties that we inhabit. The idea that people are not taking anything with them, that acting simply as custodians over the land. The nominal equity community I visited, the people there had been really committed to the community, and it existed for close to 25 years. It had been supported by government to exist as part of the social housing system. So all the people who lived there eligible for social housing when they entered the community. So I think, yeah, overall on sort of limited equity models, I think they require a lot more work from government and progressive financial institutions to provide tools and methods that community led housing groups to deliver schemes that are affordable over time. This comment here is from a local authority official, expressing perhaps some of the frustration about the lack of work across government to support these models. I think an important link to limited equity cooperative models, including for co-housing, is a broadening of our approach to land. The importance of having all levels of government thinking strategically about land has been a key theme in my research. This might be about their own land holdings, how they can support community-led housing, but also how they can support communities to unlock land for residential use through the planning system. I think the discussion around brownfield, greyfield and greenfield land, I think, is only going to grow in future years. And community-led models can be a part of that. I think there's an innate benefit that community-led projects can draw on. It's obviously in the name. And this means that groups that are already connected to the area, and they should be able to advocate based on that. Again, there will be lots of discussions about new towns and mega planning projects in coming years. But I think that the dominant theme that you can create, the dominant idea that you can create community through massive new development. But perhaps what about the idea about prioritising housing groups that already are embedded in their communities? A positive role for government in planning and land use could perhaps unlock the communal energy within local neighbourhoods that are generative of alternative provision of goods necessary for everyday existence, whether that be co-produced urban food gardens, co-owned housing, or co-managed community spaces. All of these processes are articulated to varying degrees in co-housing communities, including the case studies discussed here. So lastly, I just want to suggest some new understandings of land and property that arise from the discussions I've had. Particularly, I'd like to think about that in the context of the ecological crisis. So I think the concept of property is conventionally defined, views land simply as another commodity to be traded. This fails to recognise its particular characteristics, most fundamentally that it's finite and the source of all life. Therefore, we obviously need to flip our understanding to deprioritise the commodification of land and property and recognise that the role of housing models that prioritise notions like stewardship are focused on living lightly on land and in harmony with it. As academic Gary Varner said in his reconceptualization of property law, he said, taking an ecological view of land forces us to treat it as a public resource that individuals hold up only in stewardship or trust capacity. The other element there, and this leans on the work of Anne Apps in Australia and Gregory Alexander from the US, is the idea that we need to cultivate more forms of governance property, that recognise multi-ownership structures and cooperative relationships of people over land and property. While this limits the ability to control all aspects of an asset, there is much to be gained, I guess, from shared ownership, not least in our ability to better protect our common biodiversity. There is, of course, a lot that we can draw on in history, and this includes reflecting on the possibility of commoning practices operating as an alternative discourse and practice to the economic and cultural dominance of the capitalist land and property system. And of course, housing models can, like co-housing, can learn directly from Indigenous notions of stewardship. All the groups I spoke to in Australia were working better to relate their own practices of responsible land management and stewardship to learnings from Indigenous Australians. Particularly in urban contexts, I think there's a long way to go, though, particularly in educating ourselves on the pernicious role of land titling and urban planning that propped up the imperialist invocation of terra nullius, a land with no people that acted as the erasure of history that claims to land of Indigenous Australians. So in concluding, understandings of landed property in Australia and the UK have been conditioned by an approach that has marginalised alternatives to the to the private financialized form of ownership. Relations towards property in both countries have been formed and reformed over many years, with discernible community movements that have influenced the evolution of approaches to land and housing. I believe a lot of the sort of nuanced shared understandings of land that I saw in community co-housing communities show that there are a range of norms surrounding land and property, and they're in flux, I think, all the time, and not least informed by the climate and ecological crisis. So yeah, that's the end of the presentation. So yeah, obviously, yeah, any questions, really welcome. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Bruno. Brilliant. So questions. Maybe I could start with one while we're just warming up. That was brilliant.
Please.
And also lovely to see, Bruno, lots of examples that I've been to in Sheffield. And
Oh, fantastic.
I was just wondering, underlying a lot of your conceptualizations of rethinking how we could consider land, there seem to be some really fascinating temporalities here. There's the thinking in perpetuity, there's thinking of custodians, but you also mentioned kind of potential threats to that, like bushfire or maybe even indigenous land claims. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of how those temporalities can be thought of in like constructive, positive ways in relation to the ecological crisis.
Yeah, I think from what I've seen, and particularly those co-housing communities that have existed for a long period of time, I think what was really interesting is that they had a constant refreshing of their own understandings of their own land, even having been there for many periods of time. They were sort of constantly, obviously they see it on a day-to-day basis, the changing of the land, the passing of the seasons, and the effect that climate change has on their communities. And I feel that that's a link that I think that a lot of these co-housing communities were keen to talk about in a sort of wider sense, not only with their local communities. So I mentioned a number of the communities I spoke to, they were keen to open up their resources to the wider neighbourhood, whether that be film nights or information sessions, local advocacy. I think that was a really important way that they not only actually, refresh their own internal understandings of their land, but we're acting as sort of beacons of warning, what the rest of the neighbourhood and indeed people in government, because I think government is sort of inherently slow to these issues, and are also I think partnered with conventional developments are not willing to sort of consider, as you mentioned, some of those ecological threats that are coming down the line, whether that be flood issues in housing in flood-prone areas, bushfire-prone areas. The conventional developments are obviously sort of creating this development and then leaving rather than having an ongoing relationship that permeates outside the community. So, I hope that sort of gets to some of what you're talking about. Yeah,
absolutely, it's fascinating. Thank you.
We've got a question here, Jenny.
Brilliant. Go ahead.
Hi there, Bruno. It's Penny here, coming to you from the dark room over at Braziers. Thank you. Really, really enjoyed your talk. What I was wondering is, thinking about, the majority of people in this country who live in an owner-occupied home, and thinking about kind of what that sense of them owning their own land gives them. I think maybe this is a bit of speculation on my part, but the things that come up for me are people get a sense of security, kind of like financial security, but also kind of, that feeling of having your own space, and also maybe a sense of identity that, this is my home and it reflects who I am. So I'm just wondering, did you get any take on how people kind of conceived their own sense of security and their own sense of identity in these co-housing communities where, of course, they're sharing space together?
Yeah. I mean, I think I think that issue of equity is sort of something that I sort of that I touched on there. It was, I guess, probably one of the trickier issues that I sort of encountered around, because obviously the sort of conventional property relations that the housing market engenders is that we're meant to develop this equity that will grow over time, and and is linked fundamentally to things like increases in land value. But it's interesting, a lot of the communities that I spoke to, so limited equity models, or they were happy for their equity stake, and it's sort of obviously a really financialized discussion, but like they're happy for their equity stake to grow over time. And I think that's really important because, obviously we're seeing a really overheated property market that is sort of linked to notions of people getting huge mortgages to buy their first home, and that sort of, so what I sort of think that sort of gets to is that sort of reconceptualization that perhaps you can gain some equity that you can hold on to, but it's not going to grow in that sort of speculative way that might a conventional house might be. And I think that's, it's a nuanced debate, and, probably a really sort of technical but debate in many ways. But I think obviously people can, have that security of the home, through a co-housing cooperative type model. And, the cooperative model obviously is very long-standing in providing people that security. But it's also allied to this idea that it's not going to completely tank the housing system, which is what we're seeing. And so I think that sort of that link, I think, is quite an interesting one. I think, I'm certainly hoping to sort of tease out a little bit more, just to sort of reconceptualize those ideas of yes, what security is, and also then what the effect of your security has on the broader community. So
thanks, Bruno.
Any other questions? We've still got time, and then we'll try and wrap up about 9.
I think we're done.